if you have a very short password, they're easy to guess. They're easy to use brute force attack software applications that are out there and easily available to essentially guess millions of times over a short amount of time and eventually get to the exact, because there's only a certain number of enumerations to guess that password if it's short in length. And typically people don't apply what we call complex or strong password practices. So an example of a strong password practice would be something in the form of a phrase. So "I love football" would be an example of that. Or something like I can't wait to go home. More sentence-like in nature. But typically you want to take that passphrase and then add additional features like symbols and numbers, and vary your capital and lowercase letters in addition to that. And so making sure that there's a variation and a mixture of all of those factors in something that's very long in nature, because what happens is that the more advanced our computing capabilities become with our computer systems, the more processing abilities we have, which means that we are able to guess more times of that password in a shorter amount of time. So that being said, you want something in today's standards that's at least in the 15-character range in nature, that also has a mixture of symbols and letters, and you don't want to do something that's repetitive over and over again. In other words, you don't want to use each of your kids' names in a sequential order. You don't want to use your social security number or any kind of personal information when you're developing your technique, if you will, around that. And so really the reason for changing your passwords on a recurring basis or a very periodic basis is because what happens is the more that time goes on, that password gets more exposure, whether it's in the form of online shopping or whether it's a new application that you've put on your phone. There's a continuous touch to the internet in such a way that bad actors can actually get exposure to that in some way. So the more you operate in an online manner, the more exposure you get, the likelihood of that password being exposed in some way goes up. So if you're continuously recurring it, you're adding another level of complexity to it that varies the opportunity for a bad guy to take advantage of that. So some of the other techniques that we teach in the cybersecurity realm is also not just to vary your passwords and change them periodically, but at the same time, what you want to do is you want to apply a principle of not using your email password for online shopping, for instance, and be very diligent in how and when you use certain passwords. Essentially, the other thing we teach is that have a password that you change almost weekly and use it for any of those more high-risk type of activities you may be doing. If it's online shopping in an untrusted site or something that you just got to have those new shoes, or you got to have that new widget or that new baseball bat or whatever it may be, and you're not familiar with that company, use something like that. To liken it in the form of cell phones, if you will. It's a prepaid cell phone. It's a prepaid password, if you will, so that you have some level of protection there, and you limit the amount of personal information that's tied to that information, and you're not exposing your email, which is continuously under attack. And so those kind of principles are really the best practices that we teach. In addition to that, we recommend that if you're floating around like most individuals and you have 10 or 12 different passwords to maintain all your social media accounts and all your bank records accounts and the numerous things that we need passwords for, is to make sure that you're using two-factor authentication as much as possible. That's another feature that adds another level of complexity to it. It's hard to get away from just a standard password, but adding that two-factor authentication is another level. I know that a lot of the social media has moved to that, so that you can enter a special code, or you may it may be your thumbprint, or even facial recognition in a few of them now. So those are another set of features. And so how do you maintain that 12 or 13? And if you're changing them once a week or once a month even, how do you maintain that? And so what we recommend is in those situations, if it's not a list of passwords that you can easily recall, then use some type of password storage application. There's a couple of different ones that are out there, but if you're going to go that route, I highly encourage you to use encrypted methods to protect that. Don't just store those passwords in plain text. Make sure that there's a master password to get into that file, if you will, or that archive that has your list of passwords, so that there is another level of protection there. And there's a couple ways you can store those. You can store those in the cloud. Some people have an aversion to having anything out in the cloud. Some want it in the local environment on your mobile device or your laptop or whatever it may be. But make sure you're using a reputable password protection application that's out there. There's numerous ones, and some are much better than others. But if it doesn't at least give you the ability to encrypt that data and apply a master password, I would stay away from those. So a password is nothing more than a combination, right? And so there's only so many sequences of that. So the longer it gets, the harder it gets. So typically what happens is the password basically goes through a brute force. So it guesses, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 5, 1, 2, 3, 6, 1, 2, 3, 7. So it goes through a sequence of variations of that. And so eventually it gets to, the umpteenth version of that, and it becomes the right one, and then they get access. That's a brute force attack. So basically you've got a million guesses going at it all at one time, and eventually one of those hits. Some of the software has gotten smart enough to write code into it that only allows you a certain number of guesses before it locks you out for a certain amount of time, and so that's another level of security that some of the more reputable vendors have gotten to, but not all of them have that. And so a brute force attack is essentially just like kind of like we did in middle school when we had our combinations, just guessing your friend's combination based off of their date of birth. Very similar in nature. It's just digital form now. You'd be surprised at how easy it is to obtain some applications and really kind of just start looking at how much data is crossing around us every day in an open form. That's the reason why we say that if you're going to be pushing data in a public environment or communicating in a public environment, make sure that that data is encrypted in motion and at rest. And those are two different methods. And so, pushing your Wi-Fi address, for instance, leaving your Wi-Fi turned on when you're on a plane, probably not a good idea. Everybody wants to watch movies, when you're sitting on planes for 3 or 4 hours, obviously, but there's some limitations there. Making sure that your device is not, publicly discoverable. Those are some basic things. Obviously, we can still get to that device if we need to be. But just doing some basic hygiene. And a lot of mobile devices I've seen now are actually moving to an environment that allows you to kind of go dark a little bit. It's kind of a term we refer to it as. Essentially, it's shutting down all of those non-needed type of communications that are out there. So with all the smartwatches that are connected to your phones, there's a constant stream of communication going back and forth between those two. And so, what I'm finding now is that now, on average, the average traveler has 5 to 10 signal devices in some way, shape, form, fashion with them at any given time. And so there's a stream of communication going in and around those. When you're looking for password type of information, if I'm trying to guess your password, then I'm going to go through the typical speculation of finding out who your siblings are, or your mother is, or your father is, or whoever, and use some variations of their names, date of birth, those kinds of things, maybe a street address, and feed that into it. And so typically how these password guessing applications work too is they use a similar approach in that they use an online dictionary, if you will, or a downloaded dictionary that's part of the application. And so they look through that dictionary and they say, okay, your name is Shane, and you have these things associated with Shane in the dictionary. So they're gonna link those together and use them as part of their algorithm in guessing your password. And so that dictionary becomes crucial. And so in the social engineering realm, essentially that's what I'm what I would be doing is I would be building a dictionary of an individual, of all the artifacts that may be associated with them, whether it's their street addresses, their date of birth, if I can get a social, if I can get a property ID, if I can get a third grade teacher's name. I'm going to connect all of those dots and build a digital persona around that individual, and then I'm going to be able to adopt that type of persona to get to that next level of access, which is the goal. Typically the bad guys' ultimate agenda is financially related, but there are other things that they may be looking. If they're a business owner, they may be looking for intellectual property. They may be trying to find out what's the next big contract on NASA or the Army or the Air Force. If they're a major decision maker within the U.S. government in some way, shape, form, or fashion, or they're an influencer in some way, they may be trying to get access to email, just to read their emails to see what they're thinking and try to get ahead of that. So there's a lot of different reasons why you would want to be gaining access to that, whether it's a corporate environment, a U.S. government environment, or your personal environment. Any of those are at risk. So yeah, it just depends on what they're looking for. So, but most of the financial applications have gone away from just a standard password. There's usually a two-factor, whether it's a code or whether it's something along those lines. And so, if you're going to use that financial application, which most of us are, in many ways, making sure that that password is not the same as your email. Making sure that you're isolating that. And if you have, like myself, and you have multiple accounts, one for my business and one for my personal, at different banks, then making sure those are different than an email password or a personal information type of password. So that's another step, is making sure that you're isolating and protecting those financials on another level above and beyond. And it's all about segmentation, right? Separating your financials from your personal, and making sure that you kind of have these buckets of digital information and protecting them in a way that you can harvest. That if I get access to one bucket, I don't have access to all of it. It's limiting your exposure.